O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, section 32. And it's going to focus on something called the value circle. Now, the value circle is alluding to the Hermeneutical Circle that I would say Mr. Heidegger made famous, although we can find traces of it all the way back in Augustine. And this is this tension that you're always already in the middle of interpretation. That when you read a book, you are already culturally conditioned to read the book in light of your cultural condition, which transforms what the text means to you, which transforms who you are, which transforms you reading the text, on and on and on. So you can never, basically it means you can never escape interpretation. And yet, strangely, when we read a book, it feels like we're just reading it, that we're not interpreting it. Interpretation is what other people do, per se, but actually we all interpret. Now, the problem, of course, with interpretation is you're always already in it. And how do you know that your interpretation is right? How do you know that it's the right reading of the book? This is not easy. Now, we should be slow to assume that just because we're interpreting that we are necessarily wrong. That's a mistake. Just because you interpret X does not mean your understanding of X is false. But it also means that you can never get, say, a transcendent point where you can tell the difference between interpretation and, say, reading that involves no interpretation whatsoever. You're always stuck having to guess. Now, as the paper on certainty talks about, just because we can't have certainty that our interpretation is correct of a book, that doesn't mean we can't have confidence. And so we shouldn't assume that interpretation means that there is error. To conflate error interpretation is a big mistake. Now, the argument that's going to be made is that when it comes to values, whether it be freedom, justice, good, ethics, what we think is a good use of time, so on and so forth, values are similar. We are always already acting with values. Values are something we always already have. And of course, if we act according to X value, then we impact how the world is in such a way that can confirm X value, which then changes us, which then has us act further according to X value, and so on and so forth. The case for why we cannot act without enacting values is made very well by Samuel Barnes in his book, Missing Axioms. And basically, if I lift my hand, then I think there's value in lifting my hand right now. If I lay on a couch and decide that life doesn't have meaning, then I think that is a valuable use of time. It's just basically impossible to live without values. Now, problematically though, unless we are God, we cannot identify which values are the best of all possible values or transcendentally grounded per se, which is to say that the values are absolute, that they are indeed the best values to enact at X time or in Y way. We can never get that transcendental point of view. And therefore, there's always uncertainty when it comes to the values that we enact, and that is quite difficult. And that is extremely difficult, whereas say, to understand that reading always involves interpretation, that can be existentially destabilizing, but at least we can escape this reality when we put down the book. But to accept that values entail a inability to ground them, and we are always enacting values, well, that's an entirely different ballgame, because that means we're always stuck in this circle, whereas maybe the hermeneutical circle we're only stuck in when we're reading. Now, Heidegger and Derrida as well expand the hermeneutical circle to apply to all of life, but taking the classical understanding of the hermeneutical circle, there's a way to escape it, whereas this value circle we're describing, we cannot escape. At the same time, as the realization that reading is always an act of interpretation can kind of inspire us not to read, because why read if it's just interpretation? Now, that's a fallacy in logic, I note, but there's still this way in which understanding that reading is interpretation threatens the act of reading. Because you come to understand that it might be wrong. Well, in the same way that coming to understand that values cannot be transcendently grounded, and yet we have to live them, sure, but we can never, we're always already using values, and we cannot be sure that they are transcendently justified. Well, that could be a threat to values, because then we can feel like everything is arbitrary, and what's the point? So, as reading in a way resists recognizing that it is an act of interpretation, so values can resist recognizing that they are not transcendentally grounded. And this starts to suggest a certain problem we have, because to point ahead, the more society pluralizes and globalizes, the more we are forced to encounter difference. And difference forces us to recognize that people can have different values and live according to those values and live good lives and live practically operational and functioning lives. And so that can have an existential reflection that could lead us to the realization that values cannot be transcendentally grounded. And so values, and naturally wanting to be transcendentally grounded, will fight against difference. And this starts to point to what we'll define, what we'll talk about in the next section, called the conflict of society. Why do values resist understanding that they aren't transcendentally grounded? Well, because they lose authority. Values want to believe that they are objective, that they are not merely subjective, not merely tastes. If we start talking about values just being subjective tastes, well, then why in the world should we follow them? Certainly, why should we sacrifice for them? They start to feel arbitrary, and that can weaken them radically. Why should we follow givens if they're just subjective? It weakens the givens dramatically, and so the values resist that. In the same way that reading resists being seen as interpretation, because then the reading loses authority and starts to feel like just a waste of time. There's a list in the section that tries to express the value circle, and it's indebted heavily to Missing Axioms by Samuel Barnes. So to start, 1, we are alive. 2, we cannot live without living out values. 3, we can only justify values if we are alive. 4, we must be living out unjustified values in order to be able to justify values. Living must come before examination. Number 5, if we can live with unjustified values, why justify them? 6, if we consciously find out values cannot be justified because there is no transcendental grounding, values might cease to exhibit authority over us and thus cease to function. 7, theoretically, even if we could consciously find transcendental grounding for our values, they would just continue to work for us like they already do. 8, thus there is no justified reason to justify values. It is rational to be thoughtless and not think about our values. Well, there's a big problem there, isn't there? We can live according to values even if they are not transcendentally grounded. So what's the point of looking for transcendental grounding, or to even become aware that they lack transcendental grounding? What's the point? It would seem irrational. It would seem rational to be thoughtless about them. But what is that? Well, thoughtlessness gives us the banality of evil. So values bring with them a circular logic of which justifies participating in the banality of evil. And this is really a problem. We need values to function. If a society does not have values, then it will be oppressive. If there's no freedom, justice, goodness, and so on, the society is oppressive. But if there are values, they will lack transcendental grounding, because even if our values did, say, line up with God or the absolute truth, on this side of finitude, we can't know that for sure. We'd have to be God or have God's perspective to confirm that. So even if our finite values did correspond with infinity, we can't know such. So you can't get absolute transcendental grounding with certainty on this side of finitude. And the very act of trying to get that transcendental grounding could rob your values of power and authority. So it's irrational to do it. And yet we have to think about values and givens to keep them from forming the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about, and that we've talked about extensively in Belonging Again. So we have to risk the values that we require to function and to avoid existential anxiety due to the loss of givens. We have to think about them, but the very act of thinking about them could destroy them. And as difference and pluralism intensify, the natural thinking about these values will occur, because you're just encounter difference, and that will make you reflect on your values and if they are the values. And in response to that, you'll have two choices: turn to closed-mindedness and authoritarianism to shut down those thinking, or open up to them. But once you open up to them, there can be a realization that there's no transcendental grounding. And at that point, to handle that realization and not lose your mind, you're going to have to become an absolute knower, as Hegel talks about, or a Deleuzian individual, which are phrases, and I use those interchangeably in the book, but they both basically mean the same thing. Someone who could handle a loss of transcendental grounding and yet that not existentially overwhelm them. But of course we have a problem, because if only the minority of people can do that, well, then this will not work for a social order. But what in the world then are we going to do for a social order? Because we cannot reverse pluralism and we cannot reverse globalism. So the value circle is the relation to values we always already find ourselves in the middle of the moment we are alive, because the moment we are alive, we are using values. And if we are using values, then the question looms on if they are transcendentally grounded, which if we don't think about, we could be thoughtless about them and end up in the banality of evil. But if we do think about them, they could lose their authority. And then we lose givens, we lose our values. And that could lead to anarchism, oppression, existential anxiety, and totalitarianism. So we have a problem. And this problem of values is going to lead us into the next section where we will discuss the conflict of society. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find a link on a playlist on YouTube. You can find a list on Medium with all of the sections of Belonging Again. And thank you so much for your time.